The wind doesn't howl here. It whispers. It moves through the valley in thin, dry currents, bending the pale grass in slow waves, carrying with it the smell of dust and something older, something you can't name but somehow recognize. And if you stand in the right place, on the edge of what looks at first glance like nothing more than a series of eroded hills, you begin to realize that the hills are not hills at all. They are buildings. They were buildings, rather, enormous, deliberate, precisely arranged structures rising from the desert floor of coastal Peru, and they were built by a civilization so ancient, so sophisticated, and so completely erased from the popular imagination that most people alive today have never heard its name. Caral. Say it slowly. Caral. Let it sit for a moment. Because what that word carries, what that word contains, is nothing less than the oldest urban civilization ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere. A society that built monumental architecture while ancient Egypt was still in its early dynasties. A people who organized labor, fed thousands, developed music, traded across geography, and created something that archaeologists would not have believed possible in the Americas at that time. Had the evidence not been sitting right there in the ground, waiting. The question this video is going to ask, and try to answer, is not just who these people were. It's why we don't know them. Why their name doesn't appear in school textbooks. Why their city isn't mentioned in the same breath as the pyramids of Giza or the temples of Mesopotamia. Why a 5,000-year-old civilization of enormous sophistication remains, for most of the world, invisible. That question has an answer. And it's more uncomfortable than most people expect. If you're finding this story compelling already, if you feel the pull of something important being uncovered, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps bring more stories like this one to light. Now let's go back. Let's go all the way back. The Soup Valley in north-central Peru, around 3,200 years before the Common Era. More than 5,000 years ago. Picture a landscape that is at once brutal and precise. The Pacific Ocean lies to the west, cold and steel gray, its currents so rich with marine life that the water almost seems to breathe. Inland, the valley cuts through a brown and relentless desert, the kind of desert that receives almost no rain, where the sun is merciless and the soil seems hostile to anything living. But there, where the Supa River runs through, something different is possible. The water changes the calculus of everything. Along those banks, the land yields, crops grow, communities form. And people had been living in this valley for a long time before Caral. Small settlements, fishing communities, groups who had learned to read the ocean, to harvest anchovies in such quantities that they could be dried and traded inland. These were not primitive people fumbling toward civilization. They were people who had already developed complex economic relationships, sophisticated ecological knowledge, and a deep understanding of the place they called home. What happened next, in that valley, was not an accident of geography alone. It was a decision, a collective, sustained, extraordinary decision. They would build, not shelters, not storage pits, not the modest accumulation of a small community finding its footing. They would build something that, by any measure of the ancient world, was staggering in its ambition. The city of Caral covers an area of roughly 66 hectares. Within that space, archaeologists have found 6 large platform mounds, stepped pyramidal structures built from stone and compacted earth, some of them rising more than 20 meters into the air. They found sunken circular plazas. They found residential complexes. They found storage facilities, public spaces, and evidence of a sophisticated administrative system capable of coordinating the labor of thousands of workers over generations. The largest of the platform mounds, known today as the Pyramid Mayor, the Great Pyramid, has a volume of approximately 150,000 cubic meters. That is a number that requires a moment of stillness to absorb, 150,000 cubic meters of material moved, shaped, and placed by human hands with no metal tools, no wheeled carts, no draft animals. Just people, just organized, purposeful, extraordinary human effort. And Caral was not alone. It was the largest city in a network of at least 18 settlement sites spread across the Supa Valley, a regional urban system with Caral at its center, functioning as something that we might recognize today as a capital, a hub, a place of power and convergence and shared meaning. All of this, 5,000 years ago, before the Olmec, before the Maya, before anything the Western Hemisphere was supposed to have produced at that point in history. The origin of Caral's rise is inseparable from a single elegant economic insight. The communities of the Supa Valley had something the inland populations needed desperately: fish, specifically anchovies, dried and preserved, a reliable, portable, protein-rich food source that could sustain communities through seasons of agricultural scarcity. And the inland communities had something the coastal Supa Valley needed: cotton. Specifically, cotton that could be woven into fishing nets, nets that, in turn, allowed the coastal communities to harvest even more fish. The two resources were interdependent in a way that made trade not just beneficial, but structurally necessary. What Caral's ruling class understood, or more precisely, what they organized around, was that controlling this exchange created leverage, surplus, power. By positioning itself as the administrative center of this trade network, Caral accumulated resources sufficient to feed thousands of workers who, instead of farming or fishing, could dedicate their labor to construction, to architecture, to the physical expression of a society's belief in its own permanence. This is how monuments get built. Not by magic, not by alien intervention, not by the unexplained genius of a single ruler, but by the accumulation of surplus, directed by organization, sustained by belief. Caral's leadership understood this, and they built accordingly. What is remarkable about the evidence recovered at Caral is not just its scale, but its texture. The details that make the city feel less like a relic and more like a place where people actually lived, where they worried, celebrated, grieved, and hoped. Archaeologists working the site, most notably the Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis, who has spent decades of her career excavating and interpreting Caral, have found musical instruments. 32 flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, and 37 cornets made from deer and llama bones. The presence of music is not a trivial detail. Music in an ancient society signals ritual, entertainment, social bonding, and cultural identity. It signals a community complex enough to have developed an aesthetic life, a life not solely organized around survival, but around meaning. They found evidence of food variety: squash, beans, sweet potatoes, guava, lucuma, akira, suggesting an agricultural system more sophisticated than simple subsistence farming. They found evidence of textiles. They found evidence of what appears to be a system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipus, a technology that the Inca would later develop to extraordinary complexity, but which appears here, in Caral, thousands of years earlier, suggesting a bureaucratic need to track information, to count, to remember. And crucially, strikingly, they found almost no evidence of weapons, no fortifications around the city, no defensive walls, no mass graves consistent with organized violence. No caches of weapons. The city, as far as the archaeological record can tell, was built and sustained not through military conquest, but through trade, administration, and what appears to have been a system of religious authority capable of mobilizing collective labor across the entire regional network. This is a civilization that, in its heyday, appears to have chosen cooperation over conflict. That doesn't mean it was utopian. Power structures always carry coercion, even when the coercion is soft. but the absence of evidence for systematic military violence is striking, and it challenges a deeply embedded assumption in popular understandings of ancient civilization, that complexity necessarily produces warfare. Caral didn't fit that story. And that is part of why Caral was inconvenient. Let's stay for a moment with the people who lived there. Not the elites, not the administrators or the priests or the architects, but the ordinary people whose labor built those mountains of stone. Because understanding Caral means understanding what it felt like to live inside that system. Imagine waking before sunrise in a residential compound near the base of the Pyramid Mayor. The air is cold. The desert coast of Peru can be surprisingly cold in the early morning, the Pacific winds cutting through without mercy. Around you, dozens of families stir in adjacent spaces. The smell of cooking fires, the sound of children, the low murmur of conversation in a language now completely lost to us. Your work that day might be hauling stone, not individual rocks, but loads carried in a net bag woven from plant fiber, a structure archaeologists call a shikra. These shikra bags, filled with stones and stacked inside the core of the platform mounds, became essentially the building blocks of Caral's monuments. Each bag, once placed, became part of the mountain. In a very literal sense, the labor of individual bodies was incorporated into the city's architecture. The workers left something of themselves inside those walls. What motivated that labor? The question is one that archaeologists cannot fully answer. Because motivation lives in the mind, and the mind leaves no physical trace. But the evidence suggests a combination of factors that would be recognizable in virtually any organized society. A belief system powerful enough to make the work feel meaningful. A social structure that defined participation in communal labor as a marker of identity and belonging, and an economic arrangement that ensured workers were fed and housed in exchange for their effort. There is nothing in the record suggesting Caral's workers were slaves in the brutal sense the word implies. There is much to suggest they were participants in a system they believed in, or at least a system they had been born into and could not easily imagine beyond, which is perhaps its own kind of constraint. But it is the constraint of almost every organized society that has ever existed. The construction that these workers enabled happened in phases, over centuries. Caral was not built in a generation. It was built over hundreds of years, each phase adding to what came before, each generation inheriting a city slightly larger, slightly more imposing, slightly more certain of its own significance. By the time the city reached its peak, roughly between 2600 and 2000 BCE, it was a place of genuine urban complexity, with a population that scholars estimate may have reached 3,000 people in the city itself, and tens of thousands more across the surrounding network of settlements. 3,000 people in a city sounds small by modern standards, but in 2500 BCE, in a world where most human communities were small, mobile, and fragile, a city of 3,000 was an extraordinary thing. It was a statement. It was proof that something new was possible. And then, slowly, irreversibly, in the way that all ancient collapses happen, it began to end. The most compelling hypothesis for Caral's decline involves a force that no administrative system, no religious authority, and no architectural achievement could fully resist: the climate. Specifically, a prolonged period of drought and El Niño events, the oscillating Pacific weather pattern that periodically floods some coastal regions while drying out others. The evidence for this comes from geological and sedimentary records in the Supe Valley, which show distinct periods of reduced water flow in the river system that Caral's agriculture depended on. When the water decreases, the crops thin. When the crops thin, the surplus shrinks. When the surplus shrinks, the ability to feed non-agricultural workers, the builders, the administrators, the priests, the musicians, collapses. And when that capacity collapses, The social contract that held the city together begins to fray at the edges, but climate alone rarely destroys a city. What it does is create stress, and stress reveals the structural weaknesses that prosperity had kept invisible. In Caral's case, those weaknesses may have included an overdependence on a single trade relationship, the cotton for fish exchange, that became vulnerable as environmental disruption affected both the agricultural production of the valley and the marine ecosystems of the coast. And here is the moment that no one who lived through it could have fully recognized as the moment. There is no single event to point to, no invasion, no fire, no dramatic collapse, just a gradual withdrawal, a thinning of activity in one neighborhood, then another. A platform mound that stops receiving new construction, a ritual plaza that falls silent, a trade route that sees less and less traffic. Archaeology finds these moments in the negative space of the record, in what stops happening, in the artifacts that are no longer produced, the structures that are no longer maintained, the food that is no longer being processed in quantity. Caral's abandonment was not a catastrophe in the cinematic sense. It was a slow dispersal, a community that had been held together by a particular configuration of resources, beliefs, and relationships, gradually dissolving as those configurations became unsustainable. By around 1800 BCE, Caral was essentially empty. The platform mounds stood, they would always stand, too massive to vanish, but they were no longer the center of anything. The people had gone elsewhere, carrying with them the skills, the knowledge, the cultural memory of what had been built. And the desert took the rest, slowly covering what remained with sand and time. For roughly 4,000 years, Caral sat in the Supe Valley, its monuments eroding into shapes that looked, to the untrained eye, like natural hills. A few scholars noticed the mounds in the 20th century. Aerial photographs taken in the 1940s captured the site's scale, but generated little sustained attention. The site was known to local communities, occasionally mentioned in regional surveys, but not excavated in any systematic way. The reason for this neglect is not entirely mysterious. In the landscape of world archaeology, the Americas have historically been treated as a latecomer, a hemisphere that developed complex civilization later than the Old World, and therefore a place where ancient sites carried less urgency, received fewer resources, and attracted less prestige. This was not a neutral assumption. It was a product of European intellectual traditions that mapped human progress onto a particular geography, with Europe and the Middle East at the center and the rest of the world in a subordinate relationship to that story. In that framework, a 5,000-year-old city in Peru was inconvenient. Not because the evidence was absent, the mounds were always there, but because the story it told disrupted a comfortable hierarchy. Civilization in the Americas was supposed to begin later. The Olmec, perhaps, or the Maya, civilizations that fit into a chronology that allowed the Old World to remain the original source. Caral predated all of them, by a significant margin. Ruth Shady Solis began systematic excavation of Caral in 1994. What she found over the following years was staggering in its implications. Carbon dating of organic material, most dramatically the shikra bags still inside the platform mounds, returned dates going back to the 3rd millennium BCE. The site was as old as the most dramatic claims had suggested. Older in some cases. The publication of these findings in the journal Science in 2001 created a brief moment of international attention. The New York Times covered it. Academic papers circulated. For a moment, Caral seemed poised to take its place in the global understanding of ancient history. And then, largely, the moment passed. Not because the findings were disputed. The archaeological evidence is solid, and subsequent excavations have only deepened and complicated the picture in productive ways. but because the mechanisms by which knowledge becomes part of popular consciousness are selective, slow, and frequently shaped by forces that have nothing to do with the importance of the information itself. Textbooks change slowly. Tourism infrastructure shapes what travelers learn. Museum collections reflect the priorities of the institutions that assembled them. Institutions that were built, in most cases, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the assumptions about civilizational hierarchy were at their most explicit and unapologetic. And popular media, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels, tend to revisit the same well-established stories, because familiarity generates traffic and novelty, paradoxically, carries risk. Caral fell through these filters. And so most people alive today, people who can name the pyramids of Giza, who know roughly when Rome fell, who have heard of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, have never heard of the oldest city in the Americas. If this story matters to you, if you believe that a more complete picture of human history is worth seeking out, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It's a small gesture that carries real weight in helping stories like Caral's reach the people who need to hear them. There is something else worth sitting with in this story. Something that goes beyond the question of academic neglect or media priorities. Something more personal. Caral existed for approximately 1,000 years. 1,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. The United States, for reference, is roughly 250 years old. Caral endured for 4 times that duration, and during those 1,000 years, through the building and the expansion and the trade and the ceremony and the music and the slow contraction, generation after generation of people were born, lived their entire lives, and died within the boundaries of that civilization without knowing that it would one day be forgotten. Without knowing that the monuments they maintained, the rituals they performed, the social structures they navigated, that all of it would one day be covered by sand and lost to everything but the ground itself. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Just as we cannot know, with any certainty, which of the things we are building right now will be remembered, and which will be erased. There is a specific kind of vertigo that this thought produces. A recognition that memory, collective memory, civilizational memory, is not a natural feature of human existence. It is something that has to be constructed and maintained and fought for, and it fails. It fails all the time. And when it fails, the loss is not just historical. It is a loss of identity, of continuity, of the sense that what we do in the present is connected to something larger than ourselves. The communities that descended from Caral, and descendants did persist, carrying knowledge and cultural practice forward even as the city itself emptied, did not have a story that explained where they had come from. The Inca, who would later build their own magnificent civilization in Peru, had no memory of Caral. The Spanish colonizers who dismantled Inca civilization had no knowledge of what came before it. And the modern world, inheriting the results of that layered erasure, grew up with a map of ancient history that had a 5,000-year-old blank space in it. That blank space is not neutral. The stories we tell about the past shape what we believe is possible in the present. If we tell a story in which civilization arose in a few specific places and spread outward from those centers, a story in which the Americas were peripheral, late arriving, derivative, then we are, implicitly, telling a story about which peoples and which places matter, which contributions count, which inheritances are worth claiming. Caral complicates that story in ways that should be uncomfortable for anyone who has absorbed it uncritically. It suggests that the capacity for complex social organization, for monumental architecture, for trade networks and administrative systems and cultural production, that these things arose independently in multiple places, at multiple times, driven by the logic of human intelligence encountering the constraints and possibilities of specific environments. That civilization is not a gift passed from one privileged source to the waiting world, but a recurrent human achievement, produced wherever the conditions allow and the will persists. That is a different story, a more generous story, a more accurate story, and it has been sitting in the desert of Peru for 5,000 years, waiting to be told. The site of Caral today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, declared as such in 2009. Ruth Shady Solis continues her work there, training a new generation of Peruvian archaeologists, expanding the excavation, refining the interpretation. The Peruvian government has invested in tourism infrastructure, a visitor center, guided tours, efforts to raise national and international awareness of the site's significance. Visitors who make the journey, and it is a journey, several hours from Lima on roads that move through landscapes of striking austerity, report an experience that is difficult to describe. The mounds, seen in person, are larger than photographs suggest. The silence of the valley amplifies the sense of age. And there is a quality to the light in that desert, the way it falls on the ancient stone, flat and without mercy, that makes the usual distance between the present and the past collapse briefly into something uncomfortably intimate. You are standing where someone stood 5,000 years ago, on the same ground, breathing the same dry air, looking out at the same Pacific horizon. The question of why they built this, why they chose to make something permanent in a world that offered no guarantee of permanence, is ultimately the same question we ask ourselves. It is the question behind every library and cathedral and archive and institution that human beings have ever constructed. Why make something meant to outlast us? What do we owe to people we will never meet? What does it mean to participate in something larger than a single life? Caral's builders did not leave a written answer. They didn't have writing. What they left was stone. Enormous, precise, deliberate stone, arranged in patterns that communicated something, authority perhaps, or piety, or simply the collective desire to say, "We were here, and this is what we were capable of." The stone is still saying it. We just have to be willing to listen. Thank you for spending this time with one of history's most overlooked stories. If Caral moved you, if you feel the weight of what has been forgotten and the importance of recovering it, please subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and let us know in the comments, what other forgotten civilizations or erased histories should we explore? Your engagement makes these videos possible, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. This video is a historical reconstruction generated with the assistance of artificial intelligence. The narrative is based on verified archaeological and scholarly sources and is intended for educational and illustrative purposes.